You don't know my name. You don't know my face. I am Shadow West. Sit down. Let's play. Tonight, we are doing something different. I found a story, a dark one. I am going to let it speak for itself. And I am going to ride and listen just like you. This story has no name attached to it. No author, no origin. It was left like something somebody needed to put down and walk away from. Let's begin. Father Aldis Crane arrived in the town of Redmore, New Mexico, on the 3rd of September, 1893. He was 51 years old. He had been a priest for 26 years. He had served in 4 parishes across 3 states, and had left each one quietly, without incident, without ceremony. He was not a remarkable man. He was thin, pale, in the way that men who spend their lives indoors become pale. Not sickly, just absent of color, as though the sun had given up trying to find him. He wore his black coat regardless of temperature. He carried 1 bag. He spoke in a low voice that made people lean forward to hear him, which he understood gave him a particular kind of authority. Redmore was a small town, 412 people according to the last census, a single main street, a saloon, a general store, a sheriff's office, a schoolhouse, and a church, St. Augustine of the Desert, small, white, wooden, a crooked cross on the roof that had been straightened twice and crooked itself again both times, as though it had an opinion about its own alignment. Father Crane unlocked the church on the morning of September the 4th. He swept the floor. He polished the altar. He lit the candles, and he opened the confession booth. This was his routine. Every parish, every town. Open the booth on the first morning. Make yourself available. Show the congregation that you are here, and you are listening, and God is listening through you. He sat inside the dark wooden booth and waited. For 3 hours, nobody came. Then the door on the other side opened, and someone sat down. Father Crane could not see through the lattice screen between them. He never tried to. That was the point of the screen. The confession was between the person and God. The priest was merely a witness. "Bless me, Father," the voice said, "for I have sinned." It was a man's voice, low, steady, not nervous, the way most confessors were nervous. That particular breathiness of guilt preparing itself to be spoken. This voice was calm. "How long has it been since your last confession?" Father Crane asked. "I have never confessed before," the man said. "Then you are welcome," Father Crane said. "Take your time." A long silence. "Then I am going to kill a man," the voice said. Father Crane was still. "I beg your pardon?" "I am going to kill a man," the voice repeated. Same tone, same steadiness. "I have thought about it for a long time. I have decided. I wanted someone to know. Before I did it," Father Crane had heard confessions of violence before. Men confessing rage. Men confessing thoughts that frightened them. This was not unusual. "When you say you are going to," Father Crane said carefully, "do you mean you are planning to, or that you fear you might?" "I mean I am going to," the man said. "Thursday, before sundown. His name is Carl Weber. He lives on the East Road, 2nd house past the mill," and then the man was gone. Father Crane sat in the booth for a long time after the man left. The seal of confession is absolute. Whatever is said inside that booth a priest carries to his grave. He cannot report it, cannot warn anyone, cannot act on it in any way that betrays the confidence of the confessional. This is not a rule that priests debate. It is a vow. Father Crane knew this, and yet he thought about Carl Weber, second house past the mill, a name so specific it could only be real. He told himself it was a troubled man speaking fear, not intention. He told himself that men say dark things in confession that they would never act on. His duty was clear. He went to bed. Wednesday night, he did not sleep. He lay in the small room behind the church and stared at the ceiling and thought about Thursday, about sundown, about a man on the East Road whose name he knew. Thursday morning, he rose before dawn. He made coffee. He read scripture. He tried to find in the words something that told him what to do. He found nothing. At noon, he walked to the East Road. He told himself he was simply walking, taking the air. A priest was allowed to walk. He found the mill. He counted houses. The second one past the mill was a small, well-kept building. Flower boxes under the windows, a dog sleeping on the porch, and a man in the yard, chopping wood, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, 40 years old, perhaps, moving with the unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere to be. Carl Weber, he had to be. Father Crane stood at the road and watched him for a moment. The man did not look up. Father Crane walked back to the church. He sat in the front pew, and he prayed for the first time in years with genuine desperation. Not the practiced prayer of a professional, the raw prayer of a man who needs an answer and knows he is running out of time. Sundown came and went. Father Crane sat in the dark church and breathed. Friday morning, he walked back to the East Road. Carl Weber was in his yard, alive, chopping wood. Father Crane walked home and slept for 14 hours. The following Sunday, 4 people came to confession: an elderly woman confessing gossip, a teenage boy confessing theft, a young wife confessing anger at her husband, and a 4th person, different voice this time, a woman, older, trembling slightly, not with guilt, Father Crane thought, with something else, with the particular trembling of a person who has been carrying something too long. "Bless me, Father," she said, "for I have sinned." "How long since your last confession?" 6 years, she said. "You are welcome back," Father Crane said. "God's door does not lock." Silence. Then, "I am going to do something," she said. "To my husband, I have decided. I have been deciding for 6 years, and I have finally decided." Father Crane felt the air in the booth change. "When you say you're going to do something," he said, his voice very careful, "what do you mean?" "I mean I am going to put something in his food," she said. "Something I found. Something that will stop his heart." Tuesday evening. "I have already decided. I urge you strongly," Father Crane said. Not to, but the door was already opening, and she was already gone. Father Crane sat in the booth, his hands pressed flat. 2 confessions, 2 people, 2 specific plans, 2 specific days. He told himself there was no pattern. He told himself this was coincidence. Monday, he could not eat. Tuesday evening, he walked to the saloon, which he had never entered before, and he asked the barman if he knew of any sudden deaths or illnesses in town. The barman looked at him strangely. "No, Father," he said. Quiet week. Father Crane ordered water he did not drink. and went home. But the pattern had already begun, because the following Sunday, 6 people came to confession, and 3 of them confessed murders they had not yet committed, always specific, always named, always dated, always before the day they described. Nothing ever happened, nobody ever died, and yet they kept coming. Week after week, always calm, always certain, always gone before he could respond. By October, Father Crane had heard 19 confessions of future violence. 19. Not one of them had come to pass. He began to wonder if the booth itself was doing something to people, drawing something out of them, some darkness that needed a container. He began to dread Sundays. He began to dread the sound of the booth door opening. He began to sleep with a candle lit. And then, on the first Sunday of November, someone came to the booth. And what they said was different, completely different, from everything that had come before. The voice on the other side of the screen was young. Not a child, but young. 20 perhaps, 22. There was something in the quality of it that Father Crane could not name. A resonance, like a voice heard in a large empty room. "Bless me, Father," it said, "for I have sinned." "How long since your last confession?" Father Crane asked. Silence. Then, "I have never confessed before," the voice said. The same words. The same words as the very first confession. The man who had started all of this. Father Crane's hands tightened in his lap. "Then you are welcome," he said. His voice did not tremble. He was proud of that. A long silence. Then the voice said, "I am going to kill a man." Father Crane closed his eyes. "When?" he asked. "December the 19th, the voice said. "And the name of this man?" Father Crane asked. He did not know why he asked. He had stopped asking after the 3rd confession. He had learned that asking changed nothing, that they answered whether he asked or not. But he asked, and the voice answered. "His name," the voice said quietly, "is Aldis Crane." Father Crane did not move. "He is a priest," the voice continued. "He lives in the room behind St. Augustine's Church on the main street of Redmore. He sleeps on the left side of the bed. He keeps a candle burning. He has been keeping it burning since October. He will not hear me coming. He never does. I have been in that room before. When he was sleeping, I have stood there and watched him breathe. He looks very peaceful when he sleeps. I wanted him to know, before the 19th. I thought it was only fair. He has heard so many confessions. He deserves to have someone confess to him." Father Crane sat in the booth for a very long time after the voice went away. He sat until the candles on the altar burned low. Then he stood up. He walked out of the church. He stood in the cold November night and looked at the main street of Redmore, the saloon, the general store, the sheriff's office. 412 people. He had been hearing their darkest thoughts for 2 months, their violence, their intentions, their capability for harm. None of it had ever come to pass. Not one person had died. He told himself this meant something. He told himself the booth was drawing out the darkness so it could not act. That confession was working exactly as it was meant to work. Not recording sin, but releasing it. He told himself that his own confession was the same. A dark thought, a troubled young mind, nothing more. He went to bed. December arrived. Father Crane wrote a letter to the bishop in Santa Fe. He did not mention the confessions. He wrote only that he found Redmore a challenging parish and requested a transfer in the new year. The bishop wrote back warmly. Transfers took time. He would see what he could do. December the 10th arrived. December the 15th, Father Crane stopped sleeping in his room. He moved a cot into the main body of the church, in front of the altar, where the candles burned all night and the space was visible in all directions. He told himself this was practical. December the 18th, he did not sleep at all. He sat in the front pew with a lamp and his Bible, and he read until the words stopped making sense. He listened to every sound the building made, the wood contracting in the cold, the wind finding gaps in the walls, the distant sound of the saloon 2 streets over, slow and muffled. At some point before dawn, his eyes closed, and when they opened, it was December the 19th. He was still in the pew. The church was empty. The candles were still burning. He sat up slowly. His neck ached. His hands were cold. He looked around the church. Nothing. Nobody. He stood. He walked to the booth. He stood in front of it for a long moment. Then he opened the door on his side and sat down inside it. He did not know why. Some instinct. Some completion of a thing that had been building since September. He sat in the dark booth, and he waited. For an hour, nothing happened, and then the door on the other side opened, and someone sat down. The records of St. Augustine's Church in Redmore, New Mexico, show that Father Aldis Crane served as parish priest from September 1893 to December 1893. His departure is listed as voluntary, no forwarding address. The bishop's office in Santa Fe has no record of receiving his transfer request. The room behind the church was found empty on December the 20th. The cot he had moved to the front of the church was found with the Bible still open. The lamp had burned out. The confession booth was found locked from the inside, both sides. The church records show that in his 3 months in Redmore, Father Aldis Crane heard confession from 47 individuals. 47. The population of Redmore at the time was 412. Nobody in Redmore, and Father Crane's entire time there, died of unnatural causes, except Father Crane, whose body was never found, whose death was never confirmed, whose name appears in no record after December the 19th, 1893. The confession booth remained in St. Augustine's Church for 11 more years. It was removed in 1904. After the new priest, Father Emmanuel Reyes, reported that people were coming to confession, people he did not recognize, people who were calm and specific, and always gone before he could respond. He had the booth dismantled and burned. He reported that the wood did not burn easily, that it took most of a day, and that the smoke, he noted in his journal, had a smell he could not identify. Not wood, something else. Something that made him feel, he wrote, as though he were being watched. From inside the smoke. Looking out,